Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the CBSR ESG Disclosures Webinar. So glad to have you join us today. I see quite a few people joining the call. I'm Puninda Thind, Senior Consultant with the Delphi Group and Program Director with CBSR, and I have the honor of moderating today's discussion, which I think will be very fascinating. As we get started, a little bit about CBSR. We are a not-for-profit organization supporting a network of Canadian companies that champions business as a force for good. And we support CBSR members by providing tools and resources, helping them tell their stories, and also serve as a platform for peer-to-peer collaboration and learning. And our network of over 40 leading organizations that you can see on the screen here advances thought leadership on sustainability. So today's webinar will focus on sharing learnings and insights about the ever-changing world of environmental, social, and governance disclosures. Before we get started, wanted to acknowledge that today I'm joining from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, also known as Peel Region. As an immigrant and a settler on this land, there is a deep sense of responsibility that I feel to stand in solidarity with Indigenous struggles for justice here and around the world. And I encourage you all to learn about the land where you're joining us from, and you can check out the website noted on the slide here, native-land.ca, where you can type in your address and learn more. And we also encourage you to commit to action and read about the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So today we're all gathered here virtually from across the country. So in terms of how we'll be spending the next hour, first I'll provide a very brief overview of some recent developments in the ESG reporting landscape. We will then hear from our incredible panel of speakers, whom I will introduce very shortly. And we'll then have a conversation with our speakers and take questions from the audience. And we encourage all of you to share your questions throughout the session. You'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen here on Zoom. And so you should be able to submit your questions through that functionality throughout the session, and we'll have time for that at the end. So as I mentioned, we're thrilled to have a great lineup of speakers, all representing various perspectives on the topic of ESG disclosures. First, we have Wesley Gee, who's the Director of Sustainability at the Works Design Communications. And in his role, he leads work design sustainability practice. He provides guidance in stakeholder engagement, materiality, and performance measurement, as well as ESG communications and reporting. And Wesley has contributed to the development of GRI guidelines and also served on sector working groups with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Next, we have Sian Bereklow, who is the Vice President of Strategy and Sustainability at Capital Power. With over 25 years of experience, she is a passionate champion of sustainability, innovation, and women in the energy sector. And her expertise spans across sustainability, power, and emissions markets. She's leading Capital Power's corporate strategy, including overall integration of sustainability priorities along with ESG disclosures and reporting, and the company's corporate communication, stakeholder engagement, and community investment functions. So no small feat there. And lastly, we have Andrew MacDougall, who is a partner at Osler, Hoskin, and Harcourt. He's a recognized expert in corporate governance, executive compensation, and shareholder activist matters. And he leads the Osler corporate governance practice, advising clients on director duties, stakeholder engagement, disclosure, and other governance matters. And Andrew co-authored Osler's leading annual diversity disclosure practices study in Canada, which we'll learn more about today. I'll also note that all of these companies are also members of CBSR, and they're part of the network of Canadian companies that are leading on sustainability issues. So we're glad to have them represented here. So that's a little bit about the speakers, and we'll hear from them soon. But also to help us get a sense of who's in this virtual room, we have two quick poll questions that will show up on the screen here right now to get a sense of who's joining us today. So we encourage you to answer these questions. So it looks like we have a fair mix here. Quite a lot of sustainability team members, sustainability consultants, and communications and marketing professionals, some public affairs and legal folks, and some other category that I'm curious to know what they are. And now we'll go on to the second question. So where is your organization in its sustainability reporting journey? Interesting. So getting about 45% of folks have selected my organization has an annual sustainability report. 18% or 19% now saying my organization helps clients develop sustainability reports, and 16% noting that their organization does not have a sustainability report. So as we can see, quite a lot of different perspectives, and quite a few folks that are at the beginning of their sustainability reporting journey as well. So it should be, hopefully the insights today will be helpful to all of you. Great. Awesome. So before passing it on to our speakers, I'll provide, as I mentioned, a brief overview of some of the recent developments in the ESG reporting space, just to kind of set the stage. And as you know, this space is evolving quite rapidly, which can make it quite challenging for companies to know where to start, and for those that are further ahead on their journey to figure out how to keep up and stay ahead of the curve, so they can ensure that their disclosures on material issues are robust and decision useful. So very quickly, some key trends that are being observed in this space include the fact that synergy among voluntary ESG reporting standards and frameworks is beginning to increase, but fragmentation continues to remain. So for example, last fall, quite a few standards, including GRI, Integrated Reporting, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, SASB, and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, announced the intention to provide guidance on how they can be applied in a complementary way. The second trend is that of regulatory risk. Climate and ESG-related reporting requirements are advancing internationally, and non-financial reporting requirements are becoming mandatory with convergence around TCFD in particular. Some points to note there, the G7 recently acknowledged support for mandatory climate reporting in alignment with TCFD. New Zealand became the first country last year in the world to make TCFD reporting mandatory. And in the US, the Security Exchange Commission, the SEC, is in the process of requesting public comments on ESG disclosures. And last week, the US House of Representatives passed a bill that would require public companies to report ESG metrics. So with all of this going on, it is important for organizations to figure out how to strategically navigate this landscape, understand stakeholders, figure out what to report on, and how to go about doing so. So we hope, as I mentioned, today's webinar will provide some of that insight, and we're glad to have these various perspectives on the panel: a communications focus, a legal and governance perspective, as well as an organizational viewpoint. And so with that, and without further ado, what I'll do is I'll pass it on to Wesley Gee, who will kick us off by sharing insights on sustainability reporting and communication trends. So over to you, Wes.
Unmute myself. Great. Can everyone see the screen okay? Thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you so much for facilitating today's session, for hosting this rather timely and important discussion with everything going on within the ESG reporting and communication space. My name's Wesley Gee. I'm the Sustainability Director at Works Design. We're a design, communications, and advisory company based in Toronto, but during the pandemic, I guess you could say some of us are based in various other parts of the world just because we can be, and hopefully it's an opportunity for us to all learn a few things about our organization and what's possible. So the first thing I wanted to cover very briefly is, right now we're in the midst of conducting our 10th year of sustainability reporting and communication trends. And while we have these geek out meetings that our team has every week discussing some of the different things that we've learned, this year in 2021, there are a few things that do seem to stand out. What are we seeing lately? And I want to just cover these very briefly, but also share a few examples of what we think has worked rather effectively. So the first thing, and this is probably the most important discussion we have with all of our clients, is just an understanding of who those audiences are. Because, while a 85-page PDF report is important, it's important also to be able to acknowledge who are those different audiences, what are they interested in, and how do they want to be informed and engaged, and to see what you're doing not as a report but reporting. So to look at how you might be able to use your websites, social, and the creation of other assets like video to be able to drive that wider attention. Secondly, we're finding that overall we're getting a lot of requests, and we're also seeing that reports are generally becoming shorter. They're not that kind of one size fits all, but actually sliced and diced into a variety of different assets. So we're seeing that reports are using infographics or external links to websites, related publications, as a way of being able to provide useful information, but to not provide something that feels overly intimidating. While there is that single report that does often exists, they are often repurposed, or additional assets are developed, like including topic-specific reports, such as many companies' response to the TCFD, for instance, but also just providing data downloads. Really, just because at the end of the day, there are some audiences that really aren't that interested in sustainability per se, but they're really interested in how a company's tackling human rights, tailings, or other matters, or they may simply want to see the data. When I look at the fourth point, integration is happening, and it takes a few different forms. And I wanted to give a shout out to Sian and her team at Capital Power. For us, it's been a pleasure working with their team around their integrated report and with others. And this is where we're seeing integration as not only being able to create that single asset that does show how sustainability is integrated into the business, into risk management, but also seeing that there may be an opportunity to create also, or in its place, a suite of documents. So perhaps where annual report, sustainability report, maybe they do take different forms, but they're released at the same time. They're showing a common language in terms of what matters to their organization, what are we trying to accomplish, but still acknowledging those different audiences and what they're interested in. I do want to acknowledge that while I believe, I do believe that standards certainly matter. It's a way to show credibility. And while some frameworks like SASB and the integrated reporting framework are converging, it is really important for organizations to not kind of face paralysis, but to think, okay, there is an opportunity by engaging with our analysts, investors, rating agencies, and others to identify which are the ones that are most important. That being said, I believe it's also less important so much about the standards that you align to, but more about what are you disclosing, since it is about having meaningful management approach disclosures, or showing that your house is in order, as well as data, and making those links to standards rather than just playing tick box sustainability. And finally, more and more we're seeing, and it's great to be able to see that companies are showing a level of commitment that we haven't seen before around sustainability, being able to try to understand and articulate their impact, how they believe they create value. That notion of value creation, it's a common language that companies are using, particularly when trying to mainstream things into one strategy. Resilience is certainly the word of the year, particularly as it pertains to a company's response to the pandemic, but also really great to see, and shout out to Delphi and the group for being able to provide some meaningful resources around net zero, so that we may be able to better understand, which ones do seem to have a lot of meat behind them, that there are some short-term commitments that might support that longer-term target, for instance, but to show that there's both data and a storyline that ties to, like, what are we really trying to do? Why do we exist? How do we serve society, but also our shareholders? And, you know, shareholders happen to be a part of society. So those are just a few things that we're seeing lately. But I also wanted to share what we see as hot topics and emerging topics within this space. Some of these are probably not a big surprise when we look at hot topics, you know, ranging from the pandemic, but also human capital, and as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, for instance. But we're going to see more and more communication relating to biodiversity, particularly given the emergence of the TNFD and a new set of recommendations that should be released around 2023 that will be probably of a similar structure to the TCFD around climate change. But you know, it's been a fascinating time where organizations are trying to figure out who they are, their identity, why do they exist, you know, what secret sauce do they have, and seeing how that might feed into their identity or their mission. A couple of examples very briefly that I feel like support some of these trends. You know, with Van City, they've been developing an integrated report for several years. And, you know, what we found really useful is the fact that while they do have that PDF report, that is that kind of universal source of truth, they also have a microsite that serves a much wider audience. So while the report might be a little bit more tied to providing fulsome details, the microsite is a bit more story driven. It helps people understand, who are we, what are we trying to do, and to dig into the weeds, you can fill your boots with the PDF. Through our work with Capital Power, you know, this is where being able to show that strong tie to strategy has been important through leadership messaging at the beginning. That letter between, you know, the CFO and CSO is probably my favorite, because it just shows, you know, where those two mindsets are coming together and making really smart decisions and planning for the future. And also, you know, for this report, being able to bring what are sometimes feeling like the fine print within the annual report to the front, that notion of, you know, what are the organization's material topics and how does it tie to risk management? So really highlighting or being able to summarize that information, but also when it comes to performance, showing that there's this notion of not only inputs, but also outputs, and how the organization believes it can and wishes to create value. And just a couple others, you know, with BMO, they've been able to accomplish the same or something similar in being able to have that, you know, ambition of the organization. What is it trying to accomplish, while showing its performance and how it has and wishes to perform over the longer term, using this kind of scorecard that you can see on the left-hand side. When I was talking about topic-specific reports, this is where BMO, having an annual sustainability report, they also complement it by having a climate report, which is becoming certainly a growing pattern. I know that Capital Power and others have been, you know, doing this to provide a thorough alignment with the TCFD. The last thing I want to share, though, in this rapid fire session is just, you know, how important it is for companies to look at their website as a way to be able to, you know, have a section of their website that is almost kind of like a hub. It doesn't really make sense anymore to just have a section called investor relations, because what they're looking for is a bit more comprehensive, I think, than, you know, what has existed in the past, or perhaps to have an investor relations section, but to have a significant amount of ESG detail relating to how people can access not only their reports, but policies, codes, and external documents, including their response to the CDP. That's it for me. Open to all and any questions coming in. And once again, I really thank the team at CBSR and the Constellation Network for bringing us on board for this session.
Thanks so much. That was really, really great. And what we'll do is a reminder to the audience that you can submit your questions through the Q&A functionality, and we'll have time to address some of those after all the speakers have had a chance to present. And with that, I'll now pass it on to Sian to share insights about Capital Power's ESG reporting journey.
You're on mute, Sian.
Sorry, got it now. Thanks. Thanks, Puninda, and hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be participating on this panel today, and want to echo Wes and really thank Puninda and the CBSR team for putting this session together. Over the next few slides, I've got a few slides to talk briefly about Capital Power's view on the current ESG space, along with our journey on ESG disclosure, and just some thoughts on key opportunities and challenges as well. So in terms of, I'm not going to go through all these ESG trends in detail, but it gives you a little bit of a flavor for the kind of things we're seeing out there currently and changes that are coming at us. There's certainly a growing awareness of ESG issues among investors, customers, and employees, along with all of our stakeholders. And this is driving increased expectations from all of our stakeholders, and for companies that are measuring and disclosing ESG performance. And we're also seeing convergence of ESG investing and traditional investing, and growing expectations from the financial community that companies report on their ESG information. And I think also critical, so not just E issues. Obviously, for a company like Capital Power, E's been on our radar for many years, but it's not just E issues. Both social and governance are important to address and are increasingly also connected to the environment, the E piece. So in 2020, Capital Power announced our goal to be net carbon neutral by 2050. And we've developed a pathway, and you can see this visual in front of you, toward that goal that includes increased renewables investment alongside the application of decarbonization technologies such as CCUS, hydrogen, and direct air capture to our natural gas portfolio. So in terms of today's discussion, I'm not really putting it in front of you to talk about that. What I really wanted to point out is that this pathway, which we use frequently in external stakeholder communications, is dynamic and being updated as we make progress and can better define our pathway with more detail and certainty. And so if you look at our Investor Day presentation from December 2020 on our website, you'll see that this pathway has changed since then. And so while this isn't necessarily what most people think about when they think about ESG disclosure, I think it's important to recognize that disclosure takes many forms. And Wes referenced this as well. So, obviously we have traditional formal disclosure that we'll talk about in more detail today. But from a company perspective, it's also important to be having these ongoing conversations with our stakeholders. And we certainly use, investor presentations, discussions with government, discussions with other stakeholder groups. Wes also referenced websites, social media. We use all those forums. And I think that's an important piece to understand. There's the formal disclosure side, and there's the ongoing, what I'd call more dynamic and other channels that you can be using as well. And we just find that the more formal stuff is periodic. It tends to be annual. And so that is another one of the drivers to need to have more dynamic disclosure tools at your fingertips as well. Just give you one other example of ESG disclosure that we use in our communications to clearly articulate what we're doing and where we're going. And we use this again in our more informal disclosures. And I just will give us a shout out to the Works, because this is, we worked with them, as you know, and this is, in addition to our formal reports you'll see on our website, they helped us develop some other visuals and slides that we can use on an ongoing basis. So talk a little bit about our disclosure journey. So as you can see, Capital Power has been on a journey related to ESG disclosure for some time now. I want to emphasize that this is a journey and it will continue into the future. ESG disclosure is not a one-off project. It's not something you're going to do, for a year and be set to go going forward, but rather it's an evolution of strategic and increased disclosure. It reflects the maturity of your company's internal and reporting processes, and as well as changes in the external ESG environment, regulatory requirements, that Andrew will talk about, I think, a little bit more, and stakeholder expectations. So some notable steps that Capital Power has taken are reporting aligned with both GRI and SASB. And, Wes did reference, sort of you do need to pick standards and, choose what you're going to align with. We have integrated our financial and ESG reporting. We issued our second integrated report this year. And, talking about evolution, maybe that was more of a revolution, Wes. Just a tremendous step for us. Our first year was a bit of a Frankenstein, to be perfectly honest, but we took a first step. And that allowed us to really, this year, make huge progress in terms of integration, both from, what we were reporting, but how it came across and how the audience could read it as well. And we've also initiated and continue to evolve our climate change disclosure report aligned with TCFD. So as we move forward, we expect to continue to evolve our ESG disclosure. Again, this isn't an end state, with a focus on transparency, accuracy, and increased disclosure where appropriate. We also plan to bring a more strategic approach to managing the alphabet soup of disclosures that Puninda referenced at the beginning. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So just want to talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges. It is a significant resource requirement from a company perspective. You do need to involve your cross-functional subject matter experts. Remember, this is a reporting exercise on what your company has done and is doing, just like financial reporting. Maybe it's not quite as formalized yet and it's still maturing, but I think that's the way you need to approach it, with that kind of a mindset. And it's not a separate standalone activity. And it's sort of one of my mantras internally is we're not creating a whole new, line of business or area of the company. We're reporting on what we do, just like our financial reporting teams would do. You do need to prioritize among frameworks, and Wes talked about that, and Puninda talked a little bit about that alphabet soup. We are seeing gradual progress towards some kind of consolidation and standardization and clarity, but certainly, when you dive into this, you discover that you do have to do some deep thinking and figure out sort of what frameworks you're going to align with and what path you're going to take. And you should think about choosing a complementary set of frameworks that balance all aspects of ESG and include impacts on your company and by your company. Mentioned significant resource requirement, and also it'll take time to build capacity internally. And I think that's why it's really important to look at this as a journey. You're not going to get to an end state. I don't think there ever is an end state, but you're not going to get to that end state right off the get-go. So as you evolve your reporting and as your internal capacity evolves, you'll make progress. And be able to deliver more meaningful information to your stakeholders. Also capture risks and opportunities, and that's something we've really focused on, in particular in all our disclosures. But if you have a look at our climate change disclosure report aligned with TCFD and where we've pulled that into our integrated annual report, we're really looking to capture both the risk and opportunities in the ESG space. And the last point here, and I would just note, and it's something I had on my previous slides, one of our next steps, as you move forward, you really want to, if you can do this at the beginning, that's great, but take a strategic approach to disclosure, really think through it. There are the standards and frameworks, and there's also a lot of third-party raters out there, and that's frankly one of the more difficult environments to navigate and control. So, really think about that from a strategic perspective. And that's something that we're still learning and trying to figure out that pathway forward on our journey. And I'll just pause there and look forward to some Q&A when we, at the end here. And I will stop sharing.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Sian. Yeah, wonderful to see Capital Power's leadership and approach on sustainability reporting. And I think you left the audience with some really helpful nuggets of advice to kind of chew on. Now I'll shift it over to Andrew, who will share with us some of the regulatory and governance perspective on this topic, as well as a focus on some of the social indicators. Over to you, Andrew.
So thank you, Puninda. And I apologize ahead of time, but I don't do slides. I do a lot of words, and so you're going to have to suffer with looking at my my face instead of a set of slides. But I'm delighted to be participating in today's discussion with Puninda and Sian and Wes, and share a few thoughts from a governance and legal perspective on the disclosure. And as highlighted in the introduction, the ESG reporting landscape is rapidly evolving, and there's considerable pressure, particularly over the last 18 months, for sustainability to disclosure that is clear and consistent and comparable. And there's always been some need for ESG disclosure because employees may wish to feel good about the work they do in their place of employment. Consumers make choices based on price and quality, but also on environmental and reputational issues. And communities expect corporations to be good corporate citizens where they operate. But those impetuses for disclosure often led to disclosure that was more promotional in nature and slanted towards the good news, following my grandmother's advice that if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. But today, the public interest and greater media focus on ESG issues is prompting some new regulations. It's even overcoming historic political reticence to regulation on issues such as carbon emissions. And social media is enabling a rapid, widespread communication and collective action on issues such as sexual harassment and racism that might have been swept under the carpet in the past. But in addition to all of these, I think the biggest impetus for change today is the increased demand for more rigorous disclosure by investors. And I think there are two primary drivers of that change. The first is a strong public interest in ESG investing, which is driving large inflows of capital investment into sustainable businesses. And according to Canada's Responsible Investment Association, responsible investment assets under management in Canada grew to $3.2 trillion by the end of 2019, accounting for roughly 62% of Canadian assets under management. The second has been a strong growth in institutional investment, and institutional investors now dominate trading in our capital markets, and they own a substantial portion of the equity of most public companies. When they look to maximize returns at reduced risk, they look at not only the risks of individual businesses, but they also look at risk across their entire investment portfolio. So what does this mean? If you use climate change as a bit of an example, from an individual company perspective, climate change risks might be in many cases relatively small. But when those risks are aggregated across a portfolio of investments, they become a material investment risk. This demand for more rigor in ESG reporting has had several effects. It's prompted a shared desire for a common taxonomy on what we mean by things like green investments. It's prompted a desire for common standards of disclosure to better distinguish those companies who are making a concerted effort to affect meaningful change from those who are just blowing hot air. And it has also increased the risk of liability for inaccurate and incomplete ESG disclosures. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the liability point. We often discuss with our public company clients liability for ESG disclosure under securities laws, especially with respect to disclosures that are forward-looking in nature. At common law, there is potential liability in the event that a person or a company makes a materially untrue statement, either knowingly or negligently, and someone reasonably relies upon it to their detriment. Potentially, disclosure by any organization, even one that is not a public company, could give rise to such liability, but there are some practical impediments to making such claims. It's difficult for the person who was misled to prove that they did, in fact, rely on the misrepresentation, and then to prove what monetary damages they suffered as a result. And this burden must be met by each individual plaintiff, which makes class action proceedings relatively impractical. But for public companies, security laws step in. To ensure that information that is disclosed is accurate and timely, under securities laws, there are statutory civil remedies for misrepresentations in written or oral disclosure and for untimely disclosure. A misrepresentation in this context includes both an untrue statement of a material fact and the omission of a material fact that is required to be stated in order to make a statement not misleading in the circumstances. If a corporation makes a misrepresentation, the investor has a right to damages and doesn't have to prove that they relied on the misrepresentation. The most important defense to liability is the due diligence defense, but there are differences in how this is applied depending on how the disclosure is made. With respect to core documents, which includes the annual and quarterly financial statements and management's discussion and analysis, proxy circulars, and material change reports, corporations, their directors, and executives have the onus of showing that they were diligent. But for non-core documents or public oral statements, the plaintiff has the burden of showing that there was knowledge or willful blindness or gross misconduct on the part of the corporation, director, or executive with respect to the misrepresentation. And as a result, from a liability perspective, we have a preference for ESG disclosures to be made outside of the core documents in some sort of a voluntary report. The key point to remember is that regardless of how the disclosure is made, there is a need to conduct diligence to ensure that what is said is true and that it does not omit disclosure that results in what was said being misleading. In addition, securities regulators, if they believe that disclosure standards are not being met, can bring enforcement proceedings against the company. From a governance perspective, we've been advising companies on how to improve board oversight of the company's ESG issues. This involves increasing director understanding on not only what investors and other stakeholders are looking for from the company's ESG disclosures, but also understanding which ESG issues are most relevant to the company and to its ability to execute on its strategy now and in the short and long terms. As part of that analysis, we've been working with companies and boards on elements of reporting to directors and where to allocate oversight reporting among the board and its committees, including responsibility for oversight of company disclosures on ESG matters. We've been helping our clients develop their approach to disclosure, including with respect to identifying the measures which might be considered, which of those measures are verifiable with a high degree of confidence, and we encourage a long-term view to settling on a subset of these for public disclosure purposes. And by long-term view, I mean that the company is prepared to provide disclosure not only this year, but on an ongoing basis, and one that the company is committed to improving over time. It's not helpful for building a consistent track record to report on a measure 1 year, only to omit that measure the next year. We've also been encouraging our clients to say more about their approach to ESG in their mandated disclosures. And for the last few years, we've encouraged our clients to include disclosure in their annual proxy circular on how the company approaches oversight of ESG matters and ensures that ESG considerations are embedded in decision-making at the board and senior management levels, as well as throughout the organization. And I want to make one last comment on another aspect of a report which ties into some of the earlier remarks. We encourage our clients to be careful about how they disclose forward-looking information. Under National Instrument 51-102, a corporation is prohibited from disclosing forward-looking information unless the corporation has a reasonable basis for it. So taking the trend towards net zero announcements as an example, from a legal perspective, it's important to distinguish between commitments and aspirational targets. A public company cannot promise or commit to achieving net zero emissions by 2050 unless they have a plan for how they will get there based on existing technology. Absent such a plan, a public corporation may disclose that they are working towards net zero or have set it as an aspirational goal or target that they may or may not achieve. But the disclosure must be clear that it's a commitment that may not be relied upon in that circumstance. And those are the few comments I wanted to say at this point.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrew. And thanks everyone for sharing those insights. I think it sets us up well for the discussion that we're about to have. And I'm noticing quite a few questions rolling in, and thanks to our speakers for answering some of those live, which hopefully saves us time from answering it at the end and ensuring that we're not missing anything or missing anyone's questions. So I guess we'll get right to it. All of you, to some extent, touched on ESG reporting standards and frameworks, and I also noted quite a few questions from the audience around understanding how to go about prioritizing some of these standards. So my question is, what advice would you have for organizations on how they can go about prioritizing which sustainability reporting frameworks and standards to use? As you mentioned, there's an alphabet soup out there: GRI standards, SASB, TCFD, all of them, with different purposes, and also around assessing where to disclose what information, whether it sits in a standalone sustainability report or integrated report or so on. So maybe I'll start with you, Wes.
Sure. Okay, I'm unmuted. Great. So I guess when we work with companies, and I mean, everybody's asking that question, there's a couple of things that they should probably do. The first is, I'll get back to knowing your audience, just really being able to engage with those who own, let's say, more than 2% of your company, those who represent credible rating agencies or analysts, to get a sense of not only what are their expectations today, but where do they see the puck going, so that what we're learning right now is hopefully going to help us plan for the future rather than just get a little bit better today. So it is helpful to engage, to have those qualitative discussions rather than just getting them to fill out a survey or something like that. The second is really trying to understand, like, what are rating agencies looking for, because most of them don't frankly care whether you align to TCFD or GRI or any of those, but it's helpful to understand qualitatively, like, what are those management approach disclosures, and quantitatively, what are the type of measurable data that they're looking for, and to see how does that jive with the different standards that exist. And so I feel like, Sian, you had mentioned it earlier, but really thinking about having a really great complement. And this is where you may have something like the GRI offering a really great framework for providing management approach disclosures, showing that our house is in order. How do we manage these issues? Because frankly, most analysts don't even know what to do with the data, but they do certainly want to see that your house is in order. And apologies if I'm saying something overly slanderous there about not knowing what to do with the data, but I think more than anything, they want to be able to see that your house is in order, and then being able to look at SASB or GRI as ways to be able to, for instance, hit on those sector specific areas. But one of the things I find fascinating right now, and this may be something to stress test, is whether we want to look at the framework of the TCFD, how it's structured around governance, risk management, metrics and targets, and I always forget the fourth. Look like an idiot right now, but if we look at these four main areas, it doesn't matter whether we're reporting on these related to climate. We're going to see one coming up around biodiversity, but that structure really, I can see it flowing very well and making a lot of sense for companies who are going to be reporting on sustainability in the future. And then lastly, I'd just say around SDGs, it is something that is, I believe it is important for companies to be able to align what their future commitments or goals are, or to show where there's that connection between what are we trying to do and how it contributes towards the SDGs. It's just important that I believe that companies are selective in what they're communicating around the SDGs rather than playing SDG bingo, for instance, and connecting random acts of kindness with SDGs that are intended to be quite impactful.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much for that. Sian, over to you next, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would say I would have three key pieces of advice around that question, Puninda. First, from a company perspective, to undertake a materiality exercise to understand what ESG issues are most material to your company and to your company stakeholders. Just, as an aside, the importance of that. So there's a 2016 study by Kahn, Serafame, and Yoon, and it found that, I'll quote it, firms that with good ratings on material sustainability issues significantly outperform firms with poor ratings on these issues. However, firms with good ratings on immaterial sustainability issues do not significantly outperform firms with poor ratings on the same issues. So this just reinforces the value of undertaking a materiality exercise. You can do great reporting, but if the issues aren't material to your company, it's not going to be a benefit. So you really need to know what matters for your company and for your stakeholders. And the added benefit of that is that it allows your company to focus resources where it makes the most sense as well and be more efficient. So that's first piece of advice. Second one is, as Wes mentioned, talk to your key stakeholders, investors and otherwise, understand how they consume and assess your ESG performance. Do they take the raw data you provide? Do they rely on some of the standards like frameworks like SASB or GRI or TCFD, or do they look at third-party raters? And you really need to understand where they're looking. And my last piece of advice is just recognize it's a journey. So when you talk about integrated, I think that is ultimately where your reporting should go, because I think it demonstrates that sustainability and ESG are not just an afterthought or a side exercise, but they're actually integral and linked to your financial performance and how you make decisions as a company. However, it's going to take time to get there, and I don't think starting there is the right place to go, but you need to start and not bite off too much initially and continue and build as you go.
Andrew?
So that was a lot of great comments, and I really want to echo Sean's comment that it's a journey here. I think that is very important because we're having conversations with people that are looking at all of this, and they step back, and it's pretty intimidating when you embark upon the exercise. And the point is, you need to start somewhere. We often encourage people to maybe look for an industry type of standard because it's often easier to build consensus around compliance with an industry standard within the organization, and then populate with other standards as applicable and contemplate that it will evolve over time. The other area that, and I think Wes mentioned this as well, is, and it's particularly relevant with the TCFD, is look at the governance of your approach. If you start with thinking about where the responsibility for the disclosure is going to be and how you're going to describe that, once you've established a governance system for your disclosure, that will start to drive activity and support for gathering information and examining how the information can be used both internally to help make decisions, but also for external reporting purposes. And so I look at those two elements as being pretty key.
Great, very helpful. So to summarize, I guess everyone's points really briefly: materiality assessment, talk to your stakeholders and understand how they use the data and where they are looking, and noting that it is a journey and important to establish governance around the disclosures when understanding what to prioritize and how. The second question I have is around the increased focus on social indicators and social disclosures. And I'm wondering, in your experience, how are organizations approaching this? Maybe Andrew, we'll start with you, given Osler's work on the diversity disclosure practices study.
Thank you, Puninda. And I'm delighted to be able to have the opportunity to encourage people to take a look at our annual diversity disclosure report. We have been producing this report now since 2015, and it is a compendium not only of data on all of the TSX listed companies that are subject to diversity disclosure rules under securities laws, and starting last year, the CBCA corporations that are subject to diversity disclosure rules under the requirements of that corporate statute. But we also seek to encourage people to look at ways that they can enhance their own practices. And so there are extensive chapters on the latest developments over the course of the year, best practices in disclosure and recommended practices that people have disclosed that other organizations might want to think about as part of their disclosure. what we're seeing in the diversity and inclusion end of things is a great deal of focus, in part driven by the rules, but for a large number of corporations, going beyond the rules and speaking more generally to their workforces, frankly, in terms of what their practices and what their mission is going to be for enhancing inclusion within the organization. And in particular, focusing on advancement of women and now looking at other categories, visible minorities, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. That's been an incredible expansion of disclosure requirements that we didn't have in the past. In the US, there's now a requirement for human capital disclosure to be included in the annual filing that US companies have to produce. And naturally, that has resulted, especially in this last year, in a large amount of disclosure surrounding employee health and safety, as well as diversity and inclusion within the organization. But we still have a long way to go on the S factor, because most of this is just relating to diversity and inclusion within the organization and employee matters. And when you start to look at things such as the appropriate use of individuals within the broader supply chain and making sure that there's no forced labor, for example, those types of disclosures we don't have in Canada. They're mandated in other jurisdictions, but not in Canadian companies. And we don't tend to see much in disclosure relating to those items in the mandated disclosure. We are seeing an uptick in the S elements in the voluntary disclosure. And we do have some discussions with clients that are looking to expand that area, but it's still not nearly as extensive as the environmental and in particular the climate change areas.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Sian, would love to hear your perspective on how Capital Power is approaching the S in the ESG and disclosures around that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we are seeing an increased focus on social indicators, as Andrew mentioned. There's no question. From what I've seen, obviously one of the first areas of focus has been gender diversity at the board and executive level, and I think that's where you're seeing quite commonly targets set and disclosure beyond what's legally required now from a securities perspective. We're also starting to see other dimensions of diversity become more prominent, particularly focused on race or ethnicity, but other dimensions of diversity. And I'd say, despite the slow burn on gender, just going to plug a little bit there, it's been many, many, many years that we've had aspirational targets around gender diversity, and it's been a pretty slow burn on progress. I expect we'll see an acceleration of diversity commitments across dimensions and beyond the board and C-suite coming, as we move forward deeper into organizations. I also think we start to see and we'll continue to see more focus on Indigenous stakeholder relations and community investment and those kind of broader social indicators. And the events of the past year or two have brought to light the importance of that just transition. And I think that's where those are coming to the forefront. And that raises the importance of the social issues as we also pursue our environmental goals. And we are starting to see that. I think that's the other piece I referenced earlier, that connection between the environment and the social elements that certainly became quite apparent through COVID as well. And I think that's going to continue to bring more emphasis on the social side. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for that. And Wes? Yeah, I guess when it comes to social indicators, I believe it's important for organizations to, before they get into the indicators, to be able to frame, like, why is this issue important to us as an organization and to others? That's often a message that is maybe sometimes assumed that people understand that, but it is important. And what we often look at is where there are opportunities for companies to frame issues from others' point of view rather than their own, but then to be able to communicate, well, what are we actually trying to communicate, what are we actually trying to accomplish? What type of goal or commitment do we have in place, so that there's a very logical fit between that and the metric that we're identifying. We're not just only communicating something to be able to meet the needs of a standard or a metric, but we're actually trying to bring you in. Like, we're really trying to, find a way to be engaging, to be able to look at ways to strengthen our reputation and ultimately it's things like that can improve company culture as well. When you have everybody understanding what are we trying to do here, and it's a difficult thing sometimes to be able to talk about these social issues. It's difficult to be able to set goals that are basically doing less bad, or not equal but kind of close. But it is important to, as I think, as we've heard from others, like seeing it as a journey, thinking about what are we trying to do, what are we trying to accomplish, and being able to frame it in a type of narrative, I guess, that supports or contextualizes the metrics and the performance that's communicated.
Definitely, I think that's a great point. And for that to frame what is the data that you are collecting, and even establishing that baseline on some of the social indicators, I think is incredibly important, and possibly a lot of work to do on that end across various organizations.
I find impact to be fascinating, but it feels like the Wild West. Like, if totally. I'm being totally honest, I would love it if someone on this call, speaker or attendee, can just share what are some of the different frameworks that you use to be able to measure impact, because I don't feel like there's anything consistent that's being used, and for that reason it may call into question the credibility of some of the communication that's happening within that space. Very good intentions and maybe strong methodologies, but it'd be great if we could be able to get in, to be able to, similar to other standards, to be able to do things in a bit more of an aligned fashion.
Definitely. I think we might need another webinar for that discussion, but I think, incredibly important to be able to dive into that topic. I'm conscious of time here, and also noting some great questions from the audience. So I think I'm going to skip to an audience question here around integrated reporting. And Stephanie here has a question around understanding how common is integrated reporting, and what are some trends that we're seeing in this space. So maybe I'll pass that on to you, Wes, to hear your perspective on that, and keep it open to Sian and Andrew if you want to chime in.
Okay, very briefly, integrated reporting as a single report, there isn't a huge increase. There's a small increase of what's happening within that space, but what we find a bit more fascinating that's happening at the same time is companies being able to release their AR, their sustainability reporting, and other assets all as a part of a suite, so that there is a common language that's being used, using the website and other sources. So modest increase for Big I integrated, a much larger increase around common language, common suite going out at the same time.
Sian, Andrew?
I was going to say just a couple of thoughts. We're not seeing integrated reporting, amongst our public companies in Canada right now, but I absolutely agree with Wes. Just being able to provide some consistency across the disclosure spectrum takes a major effort. And I like one of Sian's earlier comments about bringing to your ESG reporting the same diligence that you bring to your financial reporting. I mean, we're still in the process of building in our systems to be able to bring that diligence to the reporting, getting the language consistent, bringing in the oversight the way that it needs to be brought in. So I think we've got a long way to go before we're ready for integrated reporting in a meaningful fashion.
And I don't have a lot to add from the broader environment there. I would just say that, again, I think it also comes down to the expectations of your stakeholders. And we've certainly had a very positive response to taking on integrated reporting, and and it may have to do with the fact that we are in an industry where ease the elephant in the room. And if we're not considering that elephant in the room in the context of our financial performance as well, then I think that's certainly a gap. Yeah.
Definitely. Wow, time has really just flown by, and I can't believe we're almost at the top of the hour. So I don't believe we have time for any more questions, but I know that the panelists have been answering the questions on the Q&A functionality, and what we'll do is pass on these questions as well afterwards, so that we're able to follow up with folks and have their questions answered to the extent possible. But it looks like that's all we have time here for today. So thanks so much to our wonderful panelists for sharing their insights and for really providing such a good framework for us to kind of think through moving forward in terms of how we want to approach ESG reporting, whether you're starting on this journey now, or if you've been on this journey and are continuing to figure out what's next for you and how you evolve your disclosures. A quick rapid fire summary of all the points that were, or some of the points that were mentioned from Wes around, the importance of knowing your audience, noting that they're seeing shorter topic-specific reports, importance of having common language around what matters for the audience, no matter where the information sits, and recognizing that standards are important, but also that you can use standards as tools to engage your stakeholders and focus really on what you are disclosing. From Sian, who shared Capital Power's ESG reporting journey, noting that there's obviously growing demand from investors around ESG disclosures, and it's not just environmental issues, but the S and the G as well are coming into importance. Noted the difference between having formal disclosures, but also ongoing dynamic disclosure tools, whether through your website or social media, and having that ongoing conversation with stakeholders being really important through these various mediums. Sian, you also mentioned and emphasized the fact that reporting is really a journey, so it's important to start, and it does have significant resource requirements as well. So important to take a strategic approach to reporting. And then lastly, but definitely not the least, Andrew noted, the increase in public interest and greater media focus is prompting new regulations around ESG reporting that we all have to keep our eye on. And regardless of how the disclosures are made, there is a need for due diligence to ensure that disclosures are not misleading. So it's important to really understand that. So maybe with that, I know we're on time here, so I'll thank everyone in the audience for joining us today, and thanks so much to our panelists. What I will note here is that we will follow up to share the recording of the webinar, as well as a list of resources that we'll compiled on the topic of ESG disclosures that we'll share with all the participants, as well as a post-webinar survey so that you can share your feedback, and we'll try to follow up with some of the questions that we weren't able to get answered here during our webinar today. So thanks so much everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the afternoon.